Hi everyone. 1 week ago, I should have go to Amsterdam, but for COVID reason, I could not go there. So the only thing that I could have done is to bring someone from Amsterdam here. So hi Roy, how's it going?
Hello, I'm Roy. Yeah, all good, all good. Sorry you couldn't make it to Amsterdam.
I also lost some money for the flight of April. So yes, I'm still upset, but I'm trying to forget that. But I know that Amsterdam's a cool city, and yes, so that's it. That's it. I lost it because of COVID, but because I got this in Israel 2 weeks before, because I think I partied too much. So when I came back, I had the COVID. I just felt bad for just a couple of days, but still, I was positive before, so I couldn't go. Anyway. So this is the In Action series. I think we haven't done this for a while, a couple of months, I think. So this series is just about learning about a specific technology or a specific tool. Today we have something which I think is worldwide famous, which is GraphQL. And we have Roy. So Roy, can you please introduce yourself just a couple of minutes, and then we just jump into the demo, the explanation and a demo. It will last about 30 minutes. So we need to move fast. It's not a podcast. I'm sorry. Go, Roy.
Yeah, definitely. As I said, I'm Roy. I live in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Born and raised here. Not in Amsterdam, but in the Netherlands. And I actually started programming when I was 14. And I had a great startup ID. I always liked to watch movies. And then I figured out it was too expensive to buy new DVDs every week. So instead, I created a platform which people can use to trade DVDs with other people. So if you would have DVDs somewhere, you can trade them with your neighbor and then do it like that in PHP and some jQuery. But that's a long time ago. And for the past 5 years or so, I've been working with React, GraphQL, TypeScript, JavaScript, these technologies. And also wrote some books about it. So if you see it right beside the Legos. But so today's will be about GraphQL, and it's something I started working with 4 or 5 years ago, and I've really seen the community interest in GraphQL change as well. And people always ask me what the difference is between REST and GraphQL. So I thought this might be a nice opportunity.
Yeah, I think you lost the count of how many times you replied to this, but of course, this is one of the most important questions. Hi everyone, by the way, I meet Pradumna. So yes, so can we make like a 5 or 10 minutes introduction, and then you can make just a very simple example or whatever you have ready for us. Yes, please. Thank you. When you want, we can share the screen when you are ready.
That's fine. We can leave the screen up for now. So GraphQL is, people often ask me what GraphQL is. People think it's maybe a framework, or it's a library, it's a package, or whatsoever. And GraphQL, most of all, is a specification of APIs. So to give some background, it was developed by Facebook in 2013, 14, 15, around that course, because they at first was only an internal tool, and then they made it open source. But the reason why they created GraphQL was because people were scrolling the Facebook timeline, and you can imagine 10 years ago, internet was way slower. People had old devices that weren't capable of handling a lot of data. So an internal team came up with GraphQL, which is a specification for APIs, as I said, and it's different as REST APIs, as you have way more control over the data. So when you request data from a GraphQL API, you also define the fields you want to request. So instead of going to a REST API that maybe works with CRUD, you probably get some tables from your database back, and then you get all the fields in that table as well. With GraphQL, you actually can get less data and then also define how much data you actually get. So they came up with this as a solution for low bandwidth and mobile devices. And I think over the course of the years, it changed into not only a performance changer for people, but it's also easier to manage your APIs, to do documentation, as I will show you later on. And I think once you ever start working with GraphQL, it's really hard to going back to REST again, because with REST you have no control over the API unless you develop the API yourself. And with GraphQL, you have almost complete control over the API. So it's a way easier way, especially for front-end developers to interact with APIs. Instead of having to interact with CRUD, they get complete control by just sending a request.
Yeah, let me make Devil's advocate question. Does GraphQL relies on a specific technology, on a specific framework, or a specific language?
No, not really. So a lot of libraries around GraphQL are built in JavaScript, but it isn't tied to JavaScript at all. It's the specification of how you should interact with an API. It has its own language to define a schema. So when you work with a GraphQL API, you have a schema which has all the information of that API in there. It's a bit like if you ever looked at an OpenAPI schema or a Swagger schema. Maybe some of you have. It's a bit like that, but then specifically for GraphQL. And that's the only language it relies on. And there are implementations for GraphQL in JavaScript, in TypeScript. I see more people developing GraphQL in Go. Python, I also see a lot. It is most popular with JavaScript communities, but it's not really tied to any specific language.
Nice, perfect. I knew the answer more or less, but I really wanted to make this point very important because I'm a fan of the technologies who are like agnostic in general, so they can be used in different environment and more. I think that this also makes the technology to last longer. I mean, because it's hard to replace something that it adapts based on the needs that you want. For example, maybe if you're a backend developer, you can develop maybe, I don't know, in your career, I don't know how many sets of backends, but maybe you can use the same, say, logic specification with different languages. It happens if you are a backend developer for sure. Perfect. So, okay. So, hey there. Hey, Adrian. How's it going? So, okay. So, right. Can you share your screen? Can you start doing something?
Definitely.
If you want, I can leave. Otherwise, I'll be very quiet here.
No, stick around to ask questions if you have any, and also people watching, ask questions if you have any.
Okay. Yes.
So today, I introduce you a bit to what GraphQL is. I also want to show you how it actually works. So I work for a company called StepZen, and what we do over there is make it really easy to build GraphQL APIs. And one of the ways we do so is by using Graphql Studio, which you can see on the screen, which is a interactive way to use GraphQL APIs from companies that don't have a GraphQL API. So if you would go to graphql.stepzen.com, you can find a quite extensive list of APIs that are built in REST, and we actually transform them to be GraphQL. Because we often see people really like GraphQL, so you can see Contentful, if you're using that as a CMS. They have a REST API, but they don't have a GraphQL API. So you could come here and use it with GraphQL instead. And also for Practical Dev, an example, or Discord. So imagine you're building a Discord bot, but you don't want to use REST. You can go here and use it with GraphQL. And this also really helps me showing you the differences. So I typically write articles on Practical Dev, but also on Hashnote and also on other different blogs. But most of them don't have a GraphQL API. I mean, Practical Dev has a REST API. I believe Hashnote has a GraphQL API actually. But if, an example, we want to use the Practical Dev API with GraphQL, you can either use it through the Studio experience, and then I can actually show you how it relates to all the other experience there are. So get rid of these fields. So here's a query. So this is GraphQL. If you want to request data from a GraphQL API, you typically can see on the right hand in a interactive playground. So this is a custom built one. You also have GraphQL with an I in the middle. And this is somewhat of an IDE to interact with GraphQL APIs. Because with REST APIs, you often have OpenAPI or Swagger. To explore an API with GraphQL, you typically have a playground that gives you information about all the queries you can do, also about the response fields. So I have a query here called devto_getUser. So this will help me get a user from the Practical Dev. I can typically then use this documentation part to find more information about this query, which I can do here. And then I can see I can send around parameters. So these are GraphQL query parameters. It's a bit the same as with a CRUD API if you would use something in the pod, or maybe you would use a query parameter in the REST API endpoint. It's a bit the same for this. It looks like a function, which it practically also is. And this is a query to get users from Practical Dev. And then I see my coworkers Lucia's name is in there. I can also use my username here. And then I can run this, and then it will get the data. So you can see this is me. I'm Roy. I'm a speaker, author, trainer, and I also work in DevRel. And this data is coming from GraphQL. And you can see I can define which fields I want, because maybe there's more fields here, like a username. You can see my name, a username. And then you can see you can just take out fields and leave out certain fields. And how does this relate to REST APIs? An example, I took the liberty of taking the REST API from Practical Dev. So this is their API documentation, in which you can find their CRUD API. So they have an API to get users by an ID or by a curl. So I could actually copy paste this, which I've done here. And here you can see the JSON response of this API. It's a bit hard to see it this way. So as an example, try and use this thing in Postman.
I am a fan of Postman. I think there is a Chrome extension like the JSON to see a cool JSON, but this is way better, of course.
Oh yeah, probably, yeah. Now I really like Postman, and they have GraphQL support, so I can show you how to use Postman for GraphQL as well, if we still have time for it after. So yeah, this is the REST API of Practical Dev. You can see it's taking a query parameter, which is my username. I've put it in here as well. And then you can see it returns all these fields. And with the REST API, you're limited to actually loading all these fields into your API. And to go back to why GraphQL became popular, it's because people had low bandwidth on the mobile devices. And you can imagine these are 12 lines of JSON, but maybe this would return thousands of lines of JSON. You never know. Maybe you're requesting all the articles from a user.
Yes, and I mean, of course, you are talking from a developer perspective. You can also filter this, but this is like a waste of energy, bandwidth, computation, whatever.
Yeah, definitely. And if we go back to our GraphQL API, an example, you can see we have control over the fields. And we also have this documentation part, which I already showed. So if we go back and put this query in here again, something I often do if I go to a new REST API, you either need to find the documentation, which not all REST APIs have documentation, which is, quite hard. Or what I often do when discovering a REST API, I just call the endpoint and see what data it returns, which is a bit of a bit harder way to explore an API. And with GraphQL, the documentation just showed you. You will get the arguments, right? You display it. You can also find the response type, and then you can find all the fields in here. So these are all the fields the REST API returns, but instead we can just query a set of them. So we can also get the profile image, in example, and then you can see there's some auto-completion as well. So most GraphQL IDEs, like a playground like this, they will give you this auto-completion as well, and then you can run it again, and you can also get the profile image. And why I really like this is because imagine you're working on a front-end application, and on one page you only want to show the name of something, and then on the other page you want to have a summary or anything else. It is a way more easy way for developers to do this. And this is just a basic query. You also have other ways. You have a mutation, in example, which can help you to mutate data. You also have subscriptions, which are used for live data. So if you have real-time data, like a chat application or maybe a messenger application, people typically use subscriptions for that. But this is for GraphQL. And the really cool part here is, as I said before, you really have control over the data. And in Postman, so suppose you call the REST API, you have no control over the data, which makes it way harder for you to do things here.
Yes.
And then something that I really like about GraphQL, it also helps you to combine data from different sources or from different CRUD API endpoints. So we now have this endpoint to get a user, and then probably also went an endpoint to get articles that user has written. And if you would go to the to here an example, to the API, you actually need to find out where the articles are from, whoever wrote the articles. I can see here we can use this endpoint to get my articles. If I do this, I can go to...
I don't know if you know that I am the daily.dev advocate. Do you know?
Yes, I noticed. And
Nice.
yeah.
So this makes me really happy. Yes.
Yeah,
By the
it's
way,
really nice to get some. It's also
Yeah.
really distracting because now every time I open a tab, I see interesting articles I want to read.
I also got someone else saying this, that it's too good. The problem is that it's too good. And by the way, we of course we use GraphQL in daily.dev. So
Oh, nice.
the circle closes now. Yeah.
Yeah, really good. Yeah, so oh, this one doesn't work. It has girl in there. So like this. And then change the username for my username. So this is the query this is the REST API endpoint to get all the articles written by me. It's a bit hard to read it like this, so we can open just another tab in Postman. And then you can see it's way easier. It's also a bigger response. So if I would want to get, suppose I'm building a portfolio or something with my own Practical Dev account or Hashnode account, or maybe even daily.dev account in the future. If I want to get first my user information and then all the articles I've written, I need to do two separate endpoints. It's one endpoint to get my user information. It's another endpoint to get the articles I've written. And you can see here it's way more information. There's a title, description that also has different parts. It maybe also has things I don't really want, like a social image. Why would I use it if I already have the cover image? Or maybe the last commented date. There are lots of fields in there that I typically maybe won't be using. So to order to filter these out or to combine this data, I always need to do two different requests for my front-end app. I need to get my user data and then get my articles. So with GraphQL, it's a little bit different because if you build a GraphQL API for any data source, we have done it for dev.do. You can also build it yourself using StepSend. There is a really cool way using the CLI or using GraphQL Schema Design Language to create a GraphQL API for any data source. It can be a URL, it can be a database, it can be Postgres. Because if you have a database, you can just do one command and you'll get automatically the complete schema. But for today, we actually changed the dev.do API into a GraphQL API. Get rid of this again and click on it. You can see it has some automatically generated fields for me. And in here, you can see I can combine the data. So I can get my username, my user information, and then also all the articles. So let's icon name here again. Then you can see I have just one request and I get data from both sources. I will get all the articles I've written, and then I will also get my personal information, which is here. And this is all on one request. So if I would be working from a front-end app, I no longer have to send different requests. Instead, I send just one. And this, of course, from a user interface like this. As I said before, there are multiple ways to combine it. So if you go to the documentation, you can maybe even find other ways to do so. You can find all these different queries. And then what is also really cool is you're not limited to building an API or using GraphQL just for one data source. So let's suppose you have Practical Dev, but you're also working GitHub. You also have other ways to combine data. There is a combination in here, which is called Developer Publishing Pack. And this actually combines APIs from different sources. So you have Practical Dev, you have GitHub, you have Twitter. So this is where it gets a bit more complicated. So it's probably best to figure out on your own how this works. So while I'm doing this, I also said you can use Postman for GraphQL. It's pretty cool. Let's try out this request again. And people also always think GraphQL is something magical, that it's really different from a REST API in order to get your data. So for this, I like to show how it works in Postman. So if we go to Postman, you can see you insert your endpoint, which is for the Practical Dev in example. You need to define some headers. An example that you one JSON, I think, to do this automatically for you. And then sometimes you pass in some parameters. And whenever you press send, it will just send the HTTP request to the REST API. And for GraphQL, it's completely the same. So the thing you will do, you will need to get your endpoint, which is this one. And then I go back to Postman, and I can just put my endpoint here. So this is a GraphQL API endpoint. And then there's one small difference. A GraphQL API can only accept POST requests. So a REST API, if you use it for reading data, it's typically a GET request. For GraphQL, it's different. It's a POST request. And let me tell you why. It's because you will need to send a query to it. And the query we just saw, you need to send it as a POST body. So that's why it's important to use a POST, and why the GraphQL API will only accept a POST request. So in here, I can take this query, let's copy paste it. I would be going back to Postman, and in body, you can see there are different ways to define my body. And since a couple of months, or maybe a bit more, they actually also added a GraphQL button here. And then you can also see something called Schema Fetch, which will mean that if I insert a GraphQL API endpoint here, and I click on GraphQL, Postman will actually get to my GraphQL schema and will make sure that everything I paste in here is working before I execute the query. So like this, and I believe they also help you with auto-completion. So it's a really nice way that Postman is also becoming a interactive IDE, like the playground I showed you from StepSend. You can also use Postman for it. So this is quite cool. And then, of course, I can use this to insert some variables. But first, let's try this. Send a request. And then you can see I can get the same data in Postman as well. And the workflow is the same as for a REST API, except make sure everything is a POST request and also post the body in there. And now I actually get data from two different requests. So I have this REST API endpoint to get my user information. I have another one to get all the articles I've written. And with GraphQL, it's just one. And you can imagine if you look at a typical CRUD REST API, you maybe need to combine not only two endpoints, but maybe 3, 4, or 5, unless you implement some different ways, which of course is typically fine. But if you need to do 4 different requests, GraphQL is way easier. And then there are nice ways to pass the variables as well, because as you can see, for the REST API, I can use the query params. For the GraphQL API, I need to do something different. So I would need to pass a JSON blob to it with some extra information, like my username. Write my username here. And then just close it. And then in here, this is what makes it feel a bit tricky, because what I do here, I need to define my data. So I first need to define that my variable is called username. Then I need to define the type of the variable. And this can feel a bit overwhelming, because with GraphQL, everything is a type system. And that's maybe a bit hard to understand if you're not familiar with things like TypeScript. But yeah, maybe we can find a different day to explore this more in detail. But this is a way to pass the query variables to it. So I have a box to put in my variables. Then whenever I define my query, I need to set the variable name and then also the type, because this is a string. In GraphQL, there are a number of default types. It's string, integer, Boolean, and then there is a bit more complicated parts. But these are the simple things. And the cool thing here is that you will make sure if I will know that my query needs to take username that's different than a string, and I will put 1, I will always get the error before I execute anything. Just put get hack team there.
Which is nice.
Then it will insert this variable there, and I see I use this variable here again, so I can also put it there.
Okay, nice.
Then sending the data, it will still get the data from me, but now I have one place to define the variable. And you can imagine if this grows, or if you are not doing a query with a mutation, it becomes important to add things there. So this is how you work with a GraphQL API in Postman, which is quite nice, because then you really got the opportunity to work together with REST and GraphQL alongside. And then I was wondering if maybe there are some questions of things I can show for GraphQL that are nice to do.
I have some questions, but let's start by this one, which is, but in REST you can restrict your response. Only the data, I think it means data, which you need. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So that is the interesting discussion about REST versus GraphQL. You see a lot of people. So if you look at the REST specification, REST has been around for quite some time. And typically, REST is only used to return a table from your database. And just a table, you can maybe use some query parameters. But typically, you're not allowed to restrict the number of fields you get returned. You can restrict an example, the time frame, or maybe the username, or maybe you can do any sorts of filters or orders. But for a REST API, it typically is not advised to change the fields that are returned. So all the fields should be the same every time. Also, if you look at Swagger specifications or OpenAPI specifications, they typically will assume you return all the data. And often I see people making query parameters to restrict what fields are returned, which is fine, of course. But if you look at the true REST specification, it's not really REST. So yes, if you want to know more about this, you should Google for REST-ish APIs, which is quite a... there are quite some nice discussions about REST-ish APIs where people use REST, but they transform it in such a way that you have way more control over the data that's returned. But it's actually not really a pattern that I would advise to use for REST anyway.
Yeah. Yes. So, for example, I didn't know that you can restrict response in REST. Maybe you can have a similar effect, but maybe it already seems a bit more complicated to me.
Yeah,
I don't know if it solves the problem. Sorry, I don't know if it solves the problem of multiple requests. You still have to do multiple requests.
Yeah, sometimes in REST APIs you see people add collections, or they often called collections or embedded, and then they will take data from multiple tables and put it all in one request, and then you can use query parameters to say that you want to add a collection to it or not, and which is fine, of course, but then you will get a REST-ish API instead of an actual RESTful API.
Yeah, Hanish is asking is GraphQL only for mobile?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in the beginning, of course, I said it was designed for mobile because people were using it for mobile devices, but you can use it everywhere. So if you look here, it's just an endpoint. Just as a REST API, it's an endpoint you can call from everywhere. I can call it from Postman. I can call it from a GraphQL playground. I can call it from a terminal with a curl request. I can also call it from my front-end app or from another API I have. I can call it from everywhere, and not just on mobile, but basically any device. And the cool thing here is that if you have both a mobile application and a website, and you want to display different data, then of course with GraphQL you can change the query per device. So on one device you maybe ask for all these fields, while on the other device you may be saying, I don't need the comments count or the created that field, or I don't need a profile image. So the cool thing is here you have one endpoint that you can use everywhere, but on every different location you can define what fields you want to retrieve and what fields you don't want to retrieve.
Nice. So I have a couple of questions. I'll start with this one. I think from my experience, I don't have a huge experience with GraphQL, that one strong point for GraphQL, I don't know if this is you agree with or not, is the flexibility. So usually when we develop a system, I don't know, at some point someone says, okay, but let's take also this field, or let's remove this field from the request because I don't know, we don't need it anymore. So these kind of changes, to me, they sound a bit harder using REST API. Or instead of GraphQL, you literally just remove one field, so it's more like linear. The changes that we make to the application. I don't know if you agree or not.
Yeah, definitely. As we saw here, let's suppose on one screen, so if I would get rid of all this. So this is a query to get my my articles. So maybe on one screen, maybe I only want to get the title. Maybe like this. I can just press in title and then send, and then to also only get all the titles for me. But then maybe you start developing more, and you also want to show the created date. Maybe you also want to add something else like a cover image. But it's really easy to change your fields, because maybe at some point you're saying, I don't want the cover image anymore, I don't want this field anymore. And you can just delete it from the query. And then you don't need to delete it from your API. And other people can still query it like this. So imagine you're building a portfolio. You want to show all your different articles, and you only want to show the title and the cover image on your home screen. But maybe once you click the detail, of course, you want to have more information like a description. You maybe want the slug there as well, because you want to make it interactive. So it's really easy to add fields, and you send a request, and then just get rid of fields again. So maybe we just want the title anymore.
Okay, nice. So I noticed that we already crossed the 30 minutes, so time really flied. So maybe we can stay 2 more minutes if you have. Maybe let's take the last question, and then we will wrap this first episode. Is GraphQL used to reduce the number of requests for fetching data?
Yeah, definitely. As I showed, we went from 2 REST API calls to actually 1 GraphQL API call. And for 2 API calls, it's fine, but I often see companies or developers sometimes needing to do 3, 4, or 5 requests. And especially for those scenarios, it's really easy to use GraphQL, because not only you reduce the number of requests, you only reduce the number of fields that you receive. So imagine doing 5 API calls and getting 5 times a JSON blob with all these fields you don't use. With GraphQL, you just get 1 JSON, but maybe 10 fields instead of thousands of fields from all these different requests. So yeah, that's a good question.
Nice. Yes. So maybe I have the very last question, just a couple of minutes. I had a side project that I made a couple of months ago. That it was basically, I called that project a social data dashboard. So it's something that I've never seen online. So basically, I want to see, for example, the number of followers on different platforms, but having done like a simple dashboard that just refreshes sometimes. Okay, and maybe do some very simple, I don't know, we can sum the followers, or I don't know, do something basic stuff without checking all the social media at the same time. For example, I'm active on the different social media. So, for example, I've done this using REST because I don't know, I was checking because for some social media we need to do the authentication part. So we need something different. Do you think that this can be achieved with GraphQL or not?
Yeah, definitely. Even if you go to steps in GraphQL Studio, what we've done here, we actually took a number of APIs, also for Web3 or for practical dev. And I think you can maybe already get here. So if you're writing articles on dev.to, if you have a Discord channel, if you have maybe a Twitter account, which is in here somewhere as well, you can already take the data from all these different APIs and then query them using GraphQL. And then these are many fields. You can just get rid of most of the fields if you're not really using them. You can also add GitHub to it, or maybe other any APIs. If people are missing APIs here, also feel free to reach out to me, and I can even help you to add them yourself.
Okay, so I think that I'll try, because I have this project. I think I have like 6 or 7 social media. It took me a while because for some of them you need the authentication to get the token to activate. But at some point I reached a very a decent level, and I'm exposing the dashboard with Grafana, for example. So it's just literally fetching data, showing the dashboard. I don't know if you know Grafana. And yes, so project having REST API with Docker plus Kubernetes. I've never done. I am a huge fan of Docker. I'm a Docker captain, and I've never done GraphQL and Docker video. But probably I should do some of them. So this is also one of the reasons why I wanted to just take a look at this maybe before jumping into doing some live streams. And I don't think it is related to Docker and Kubernetes, but I don't know. So what do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, it can work. I mean, it's just GraphQL is just a technology to build APIs, and how you deploy them, either with Docker and Kubernetes or somewhere serverless, doesn't really matter.
Yeah, exactly. So they work. Of course, you just need the dependency, I think, in the project, and that's it. Okay, Roy, can I stop sharing the screen, or do you want to share something else? Okay, I think this has been the fastest half hour since the beginning of the year. So it has been really super fast, but I really enjoyed this very clean explanation of the strong points of GraphQL. Of course, we are biased here, but I see that probably if I would start a real world project now, I would do this with GraphQL. And just the last reminder, we have shown Justin, which is super, super simple. So just fetching one API. But if you do a real world project, I promise you that the level of complexity of development, it really grows with an exponential growth. So like you start having 10 requests, 8 requests for doing something. You do need multiple requests for some API. So it gets harder and really, really easy. This is from my experience. So this can really help to reduce the complexity of an application. Yes, so we have some people say thank you. We are about to wrap this episode of the In Action, GraphQL in Action, this episode. So thank you so much, Roy. Would you like to give a final message, to say something before we close?
Yes, thank you. Thanks everyone for joining. And if you want to know more about GraphQL, you can also follow me on Twitter with the handle @gethackteam. It's in my it's below my face here. So make sure to follow me.
Let me find it.
If you want to learn more follow-up questions, I'm happy to help you getting started.
Okay, yes, let me just a couple of seconds. Okay, so this is the link. Okay, perfect. Roy, thank you so much. This has been really insightful, simple, and this is perfect for this series. So yes, perfect.
Yes, thank you. And send me a message if you ever try to go to Amsterdam again.
I had some FOMO that you can't even imagine, because I'm also active on Twitter. So I had all my friends on Twitter, because that was the Ethereum Amsterdam event. So,
nice.
Yes, so I missed that, and also the King's Day. I think are you still in the King's Day period or not?
It was this Wednesday.
No, okay.
You missed it.
So basically, I missed everything. So next year for sure. If next year we will be an Ethereum Amsterdam on some events, I've also started become active as a public speaker. So maybe, I don't know, we can meet sometimes, and let's see. Perfect. Okay. Bye, Corey. Bye, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining. This has been super simple and super clean explanation. Thank you so much, Roy. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Just a moment.